Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's current affairs programme. My name's Emma Webb, and this week I'm joined by the director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle, and Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, historian and senior fellow here at the New Culture Forum. So let's begin with this week's story about migrants, particularly in Dover, this story that we saw in the Times this week, that some residents have been literally sleeping with sledgehammers underneath their beds because they've had so many issues with people breaking into their houses, breaking into their gardens. One young migrant who forced his way into a woman's home made her lock her dog in the bedroom and demanded to use her phone to demanded that she drive him to Manchester, and then when she refused, demanded that he use her phone to call someone to pick him up. So what are your thoughts on this story?
Well, I suppose I was quite surprised to see it, actually, because I think what's been quite interesting with this story and with a few others is that, including the BBC actually, is that there suddenly seems to be some kind of epic of honesty about the reporting. It's almost like the pennies sort of dropped. I think it might have been since the whole Albanian issue came up. But no, it's appalling that this is happening, because there obviously, I think in one case, there was a woman in this report who came across this asylum seeker, and he said, no police, or whatever. They don't obviously want to be, they're on the run. And obviously to see this written in the Times without sort of some kind of soft soaping was quite surprising to me, because I saw it next to a piece about there having been discussions in the civil service about using London's parks for tent cities, which does really sound dystopian, doesn't it? You can just imagine it now.
That article was interesting because the article straightforwardly said they were talking about using the parks as tent cities, and then probably about 2/3 of the way through the article it said that the Home Office basically said that this isn't the case, and it was just sort of like bending of
I know, but the fact is, as we all know, the mere fact that this even came up at presumably a high level, it does not fill one with confidence.
No. And actually, I mean, from this story, the impression that you get from this particular town is it's basically overrun, and it's terrifying because they're not able to leave their doors open so that their dogs can go out. They have to make sure their doors are locked at all times because people are literally jumping into their gardens and coming into their house. Like, this is a serious threat to people's safety, and the police don't have any means to deal with it.
Well, no, I think that
or they're not
the police are not there.
Yeah.
This is the point. People are having to deal with this. It's enraging, actually, and the police are nowhere to be seen. If they were there, one can't help feeling that they would take a certain kind of attitude.
And what do you think, Rafe?
I just think it's so sad and depressing that we've got to this stage. I mean, what was in King Richard II, Shakespeare said, about England, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war. Well, we were a wonderful island. We did have the White Cliffs of Dover and everything protecting us. And, people living in Dover, of all places, on one of those nice cobbled streets, having their afternoon tea, listening to the archers. The last thing that you're expecting is some chap from the continent or from North Africa or wherever running through your garden and into your drawing room. I mean, the fact that we're living in that sort of state now, or as Peter was saying, having illegal immigrants basically being housed in the central parks in tents, in Kensington Gardens or wherever. I mean, what a shocking state of affairs
it's
that we have.
It's an admission of chaos.
It's an admission of chaos, but there's also the admission of the reality that these aren't women and children fleeing persecution and war. We now know that the single largest group of immigrants to this country, of illegals coming across the Channel, are Albanians. 12,000 have come over in
Albanian men
this year alone. Of that 12,000, 10,000 single adult males. There were only 50 who came over 2 years ago. Now, Albania is not a land riven by war, pestilence and persecution. There's absolutely no excuse for them coming over here other than the fact that it's orchestrated by criminal gangs. And it's also worth remembering that one of the single largest foreign groups in our prisons is also Albanians. Now, Albania only has 2.8 million people, right? So from 2.8 million people, we have the number one number of cross-channel crossings and the largest group in our prisons. There's something seriously wrong here when between 1% to 2% of the entire adult healthy male population coming over here, and I'm pretty sure they're not all transgendered people escaping persecution in their home country. Something has gone very wrong here. So we have to face up to that fact. And also, as I've said for years now, it's high time we implemented a proper policy. Forget about trying to push boats back. Let's scoop up all those boats, take them off on ships off to one of the British overseas territories like St Helena or Georgia in the South Sea Islands, and process them there. Because if they're being processed on a windswept island off the Atlantic, you can guarantee that after a few weeks of that, the channel crossings will go down to a mere dribble.
Well, speaking of incentives, in relation to the tent city, one of the proposals has been that they should get rid of the ban on asylum seekers being able to work, which surely would just, these Albanians, for example, coming over, it would just be further incentive, because you just come here and then immediately you can work.
Well, yes, but I don't know how many of them are coming here to work anyway.
Or probably they're working in the black economy
many
or
of them,
something.
I think, there are these gangs and everything, Albanian gangs. I think that it's just the sheer and utter spinelessness of the people who are meant to be looking after us, meant to be taking care of the country. That is the most worrying thing. We've had this week, haven't we, sort of certain murmurs from the new administration, if you want to call it that these things are going to be looked at again, and that, we will get control of our borders. Why anyone should actually even believe that? Not after all these years. I think the thing is, as well as what Rafe was saying there, is that what really gets me particularly, and what I think people should always be aware of, is that now suddenly what we always said has been proved true. So now it's basically that these are mostly economic migrants or whatever, but certainly not asylum seekers, all young men of fighting age. For so long, the official line was to come down hard on anyone who said that. And the fact is, it is true. So, I think one should, hold to one's own views on this. I mean, people watching, if they kind of get in, because even now you get your Polly Toynbee types, if not her, actually saying, how can you be so uncompassionate? These are rubbish. Look.
Well, on BBC Radio today, at the World at One, I was listening to, and they had an interview with a French politician who's very involved in these sorts of discussions about immigration. And she said, if you want to stop them coming over, stop making Britain more attractive than France. This is pretty basic stuff, in terms of benefits, in terms of what you receive here. There's a reason people are encamped at Calais and coming over here when they could quite easily go down to Nice and have a nice warm time on the Mediterranean rather than try to come here in October, right?
Yes,
How much mileage do you think there is to this idea that they're going to make it so that anybody who's coming over illegally can't stay here? Do you think that they're actually going to be able to find a way that, Suella
I don't even think it's about finding a way. You've just got to have the will.
That's been the policy in Germany, right? So after the great catastrophe of Angela Merkel bringing in all of those Syrian refugees, the policy now in Germany is that you're only allowed in on a visa and you have to be returned home. They've learned that the hard way. Why that hasn't been touted by Suella Braverman or by Priti Patel before her, I don't know, because it's eminently sensible that you're here because of suffering, and you should go back at the end of that period once the situation is better. Also, if you want to discourage people from coming, don't offer them potentially, a camp city in the heart of London with all of its amenities and everything else. Put the Orkneys, what's wrong with that? No, but I'm quite serious about this,
I think the people
Cold
of Orkney might
climates
have something
and
to say about
camps
that.
up there. No, but for example,
Gordonston.
when my mother's family came over in the Second World War to fight in the Royal Air Force and in the Navy and so forth, after the war, they were set up in refugee camps. They had a choice. You can go back to communist Poland. The British government knew that they wouldn't want to do that because of life there, but they were perfectly prepared, my mother's cousins, to live in these refugee camps, and they got married there, and they had marriage ceremonies in these refugee camps until the time came when they actually had housing allocated to them. If they were able to do that, why can't we even contemplate the discussion of refugee camps in this country today? It was good enough for our grandparents' generation to live in these refugee camps, which are perfectly livable places, and yet people aren't brave enough or willing enough to have that discussion today, or even to be aware of the fact that it was quite commonplace in the 1950s.
Why is that? Why do you think that is? That they don't. That there's a kind of like optics problem with the idea of suggesting that people should actually go and stay in refugee camps until they can go home. Because I think even whenever we talk about asylum, and particularly as you say, Peter, because most people have known in their hearts for a very long time these are economic migrants, despite the attempt to kind of suppress that.
I think the EU actually called them economic migrants at one point.
I mean, there's this idea that asylum is open-ended in some way.
Yeah.
So why do you think it is that there is this optics problem? Is this the kind
It's
of...
It's the whole notion of be kind. It's the idea that I couldn't possibly see myself in this scenario. No, you have to give them a hotel room.
Is it the idea that there's something kind of cringing about the idea of even having borders, that there's something just unjust about that?
I think that's absolutely at the heart of it. I think that, yes, it's to be kind, and there are people, I said that they are possibly well-meaning but naive, but I think that far overriding that is actually a dislike of the whole idea that we should somehow or other try to preserve something. They don't like it. They don't want to preserve it. Anything that dilutes it. Peter Hitchens was very clear on this at one point. And it seems to me, it's been crystal clear to me for years. He said, we didn't really care about immigrants. Well, when we used to talk about it in the 1970s, he said, anything which is going to dilute or destroy the British identity or British state or whatever, we were for. And I think that is absolutely what is at the heart of this. I was reading comments underneath the Times.
You mean when Peter Hitchens was a Trotskyist?
Yes. Or even, I think, even David Goodhart said something similar, actually. That it just wasn't cool to be patriotic. Anything which somehow went against it. And that is still very much...
And do you think that the tail end of that is not necessarily that, very straightforward ideological reason, but more that many people en masse have sort of lost the ability to justify why borders themselves are not somehow inherently unjust, why they matter and why they're important.
They've been told they're racist.
Yeah.
And there are sanctions around that. That's why.
Well, I agree entirely. My point wasn't about the broader issue of borders and so forth. It was more the practical issue of the fact that we have hotels crammed full of people. Even 5-star hotels being told to take in these illegal migrants or people claiming asylum. We have government ministers and others, and we had that terrible Labour MP Stella Creasy saying, the Ukrainian example shows us what to do. People should allow all of these asylum seekers into their own homes. Well, I'm sorry, we know now 6 months after the Ukrainian refugees came into people's homes, they're not being asked to stay for another 6 months because it's too much of an imposition on people. But my point was about that's why we aren't willing enough to actually take a cold, hard look at having proper refugee camps. It's because people want to have this be kind thing, hotel rooms, come and stay with the family. No, you need to actually build proper refugee camps in this country to process these people, take the weight off the councils and off the hotels, but also act as a disincentive. But these are perfectly nice places to stay. They're not some sort of ramshackle places.
Let's move on to Rishi Sunak, and obviously since the last time I hosted this show, clearly politics now works in dog ears, and so much has happened. Because this is also important with respect to Suella Braverman, because I think that, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, you might think I am, I think that she really does actually want to deal with things. I think that she personally has the will to get through a lot of these problems. Whether it's possible to do that from within the blob, I don't know. But there are, at the moment there is some doubt about whether or not she's going to stay as Home Secretary. Rishi, obviously informing his cabinet, has done so, I think, with a mind to bringing in the right of the party as he perceives it, to try and balance the ship somewhat. So we can talk about Rishi a little bit later, but first of all, how do you think that Rishi's premiership is going to have an effect on this issue to do with the migrant crisis, and particularly these poor people in Dover who are basically having their homes broken into and can't sleep at night?
It's difficult to say at this point. We do know that Rishi understands full well that immigration is an important issue which he needs to have at least some attempt at tackling if it's going to have any hope of getting anywhere at the next general election. But there's also the idea that that Suella Braverman was appointed to Home Secretary in the understanding that she was probably going to shoot herself in the foot at some point in the near future and end up being turfed out, she would force herself out by her own hand. So, but at the same time, let's just take things on face value as they are. I think it's very good. It's a very good appointment. I have a lot of time for Suella Braverman. I was so pleased to understand what happened behind the scenes between her and Liz Truss, and how appalled she was at Liz Truss's attempts to increase immigration. Now, I think she can be rather cack-handed in her comments and things. I don't think she's very slick, and she does cause herself unnecessarily scandal at times. But certainly, if the ERG and the right of the party is to maintain a force within the cabinet, we can only hope that they apply pressure to Rishi Sunak. But, at the same time, we know full well that the courts always intervene. So whatever Suella Braverman is going to try to do, I can just see the courts slowing the process down.
Yes, I mean, or even before you get to the courts, her own civil service. This is the problem, is that, there's this huge layer.
The blob.
Well, yes, the blob. I always thought the blob really was the education establishment. That's how I understood it. But yes, I mean, essentially, this sort of whole slice of people just stay there and they don't move, and essentially they're
rigged.
Yeah, and they will thwart. Indeed, they have been thwarting, haven't they?
It's worth noting as well, just because a lot of people criticise Rishi Sunak for various things. Yeah, in 2016, he actually voted for for Britain to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. People don't seem to remember
Which
that.
is a nice point of synergy between him and
exactly. So he's people forget Liz Truss was the Remainer. He was the Brexiteer, right? So for some reason, people have got this all twisted in their minds, and he's spoken out very forcefully about the fact that a woman is a woman, and we see talk about
people
him.
seem to be surprised that he'd appointed some Brexiteers to his cabinet.
And he's appointed Kemi Badenoch, of course, to be the Equalities and Women's Minister. And there's talk that Rishi Sunak wants to amend the Equality Act so that women will be biological women, which would therefore ban trans persons from women's sports and safe spaces. So he's not this lefty part of the Tory party that everybody seems to think he is. So there's every reason to believe that if there's a way to bypass the courts on these issues, that he will give his support in whatever way possible.
Do you think that it's possible for Rishi to unexpectedly pull the Conservative Party back from the brink in time for the next general election?
I think that what they've looked over into the abyss. That's the way I see it with Liz Truss. They kind of looked and they saw their...
And it scared the bejesus out of them.
Yes, exactly, the destruction. I mean, I think I've said this time it really looks like they're going. However, I think there is the chance. What struck me, and I know a lot of people probably watching won't agree with this, but when I watched the Prime Minister's questions this time, it was reassuring to see what seemed like sentient people speaking. I thought he handled it well, actually. And I was sort of therefore very encouraged. I think that the Tory party, though, might have thought, they might in a few months' time look back and think, what the hell were we doing? We became that close. Yeah. What's also interesting is that people change their tune, it being politics. So, for example, David Frost, who's been on this channel, Lord Frost, wrote in the Telegraph today about how the Tories have got to get a grip on migration, for example, to go back to our... otherwise they're doomed. Well, I don't think it's something he's talked about a lot before. So these issues are sort of maybe going up. Like you both, I mean, I like the fact Suella Braverman's there, and I like the fact that Kemi is there. And the others I don't really care so much really about. But I think so far, they seem to have suddenly got a grip.
Yeah.
So...
All I'd say is that had Rishi succeeded Boris immediately, the Tories will be in a very good position to win at the next general election. I think there's no doubt about that, because they're only 5% behind in the polls. Coming back from 30% with a 30% deficit is another game entirely.
I do wonder whether and I think that if Rishi had followed Boris immediately, then we wouldn't end up with the nature of a Rishi government, as we will do, without that interim of Liz Truss and the madness, the chaos, staring into the abyss. In terms of a broad cabinet. And so I think that actually the chaos of that few weeks and the staring into the abyss, I think may actually have been what was required. I think if it had just been straight Rishi, we would have ended up with something.
I'm not so sure. Well, we don't really know, do we? We have no idea whether that's true or not. But I think even if it wasn't,
Schrodinger's cabinet.
Even if it wasn't, though, I think the Tory party would be in a far stronger place, because people, I think, have to remember. I know a lot of our viewers, for example, will have been upset about Rishi Sunak, but Sunak wasn't the candidate for the party. He was the candidate for the voters of the nation. And I think people need to understand that. Okay, sure, people on the hard right didn't like Rishi Sunak, but whoever they would have chosen wouldn't have been able really at this point to have posed a real threat to Starmer. Rishi Sunak was the one to appeal to people who aren't Tory party members, but who could have voted Tory. In the same way that Blair did to get to the centre ground. And you have to, at the end of the day, say, what's the lesser of two evils? Having the Tories in power or having Labour in power? Now, if it means biting your lip and having Rishi Sunak as your leader, or the alternative is having Keir Starmer and the woke Labour Party coming in, I would rather bite my lip and have Rishi Sunak, knowing at least that things could be bad, but they're not going to be as terrible as they would be.
I think, though, although obviously we'll never know, and we have the benefit of hindsight, but I think that particularly because Rishi was so close to the government in being embroiled in all of the Partygate stuff, and there was all of the tax hoo-ha, I think that if it had gone straight to him, we would have seen a continuation of that previous madness. So we got a sort of interlude of Liz Truss's sort of nightmare, and then
it's a valid point, but I think Rishi Sunak is such a skilled speaker compared to Keir Starmer, and he basically represents everything that Keir Starmer previously represented. He was the calm. Starmer was the calm, clear, precision, details man that Boris wasn't, and that's exactly what Rishi is. And of course, Rishi is also Asian, which makes it very hard again for the woke ideology or for identity politics to be played against him as it was played against Boris Johnson so easily.
That point.
But hang on, just before you go on, I mean, yes, I think they realise that that's when they've suddenly kind of pivoted to class, right, and money. I think that they really do an injustice to the majority of people in this country who don't really care that he's hugely rich. It's a bit like with the old Etonian argument. Do people really care that Boris or Cameron were old Etonians? These are the sort of factors that mean a lot to the Westminster bubble, but not really to most people. They think, well, is he good or not? Or Liz Truss wasn't hugely rich; she was terrible.
It's a kind of solipsistic snobbery, isn't it? They sort of, from their own position of being reasonably elevated, assume that the rest of the country would have that kind of inverted snobbery of saying, well, these people don't represent me because they're...
I would say, actually, it's a bit more simple than that. I think what it is that they just see politics entirely superficially. They report on it 24 hours a day, and they think, he's up, he's down, she's up, he's down. Go outside the country, I think there's the wisdom of crowds, and I think that they can overlook.
And of course, the reality is that it was actually Rishi Sunak who was the one behind the furlough scheme, looking after the lowest paid workers in society. He understands, actually, he is a centre-right person economically, but he's taken his policy centre-left because he knows that's where the red wall are. And he knows what needs to be done there. You don't get £730 million by being an idiot, right?
Yeah.
And he fully understands the needs of the voters, particularly his Tory red wall voters. And that's why you also saw with Levelling Up when he was Chancellor, he was actually allocating so much towards the north of England in terms of funding projects and so forth. So the idea that he's out of touch is completely wrong.
And also, you quite want someone to be in charge who's good with money, don't you? It would be a bad sign if, as a certain Prime Minister was, particularly sort of leaky with it. So I wanted to bring up this US clip, and maybe we'll be able to play that or link it below, from The Daily Show with this guy, I can't remember his name.
Trevor Noah.
Is he a South African comedian? He sounded South African. And he was talking about the backlash against Rishi Sunak and how racist Britain is.
Watching the story of Rishi Sunak becoming England's first Prime Minister of colour, of Indian descent, of all of these things, and then seeing the backlash is one of the more telling, it's just one of the more telling things about how people view the role that they or their people have played in history. And what I mean by that is this. You hear a lot of the people saying, oh, they're taking over. Now the Indians are going to take over Great Britain, and what's next, and what? And I always find myself going, so what? No, but stick with me here. So what? What are you afraid of? Right, all of them. You see people in the UK, you see people like Tucker Carlson all the time saying, you know what they're trying to do? you know, they won't stop until black people and women are in positions of power.
And I just found myself watching that clip and thinking, what backlash is he talking about? These people are living completely in their own imaginations. And I know, Rafe, you tweeted
it's an alternate
something,
reality.
hit the nail on the head.
So, The Daily Show in America has been around for a good 20 years, originally with Jon Stewart, and increasingly, it's sort of similar today to the MASH report in a way, but in America, increasingly, people are getting their news from these comedy shows rather than from actually watching CNN or Fox News. And so you get it with the Stephen Colbert show and so forth, even James Corden. That's where people get their daily news stories. And Trevor Noah has taken over, and he's, being from South Africa, has got this sort of anti-colonial, Britain is the evil empire mindset, and he has for a long time. And so rather than treating accurately the election of Rishi Sunak as a great example of how Britain, unique in Europe, almost unique in the Western world, can elect somebody who's not of that indigenous population, he chose to completely subvert it and say that there was a backlash against it. And the evidence of this backlash was one person calling into an LBC radio show and saying that Rishi Sunak wasn't English because he wasn't white and so forth. And on the basis of that one anecdote, has fabricated...
Who was probably someone who was picked by the producers because he had the maddest, most extreme view they could find.
The problem with the left, though, is that they use anecdote over evidence all the time. One example, one anecdote does not a case make. And yet this happens all the time. Evidence, which we used to back up things with, no longer counts for the left or for the woke brigade. And so you've got this whole story, which is now swept through America, and this audience cheering it, all of whom were wearing masks, mind you. In October of 2022, they're still wearing masks in the audience. And they all believe because he's become
weird
this
time capsule of June 2020.
But if you're a comedian in America, for some reason your utterances are taken as gospel in a way that the news broadcasters are no longer done. It's a very weird world. And he's now become the epitome of what he used to rail against, Fox News' so-called fake news and culture wars, when he's blatantly lying.
Yeah, no, it's. I think it's part of a general change in the US attitude to Britain, a regrettable one. In the past 20 years, certainly not in the 90s, but it is now, there are big parts of American culture which see Britain as being this appalling place. We've talked about the New York Times before, right? It is not even just sort of like a slight amusement about Britain or anything like that. It's outright dislike, outright lies. I mean, they
just
famously...
bigoted porridge eaters, that's...
Well, they do, there's that, right? But they also just make sure to hire left-wing writers, British writers, whatever. And I think there was one headline during the pandemic of ethnic minorities left to die in Britain during the pandemic. This, it goes through parts of American culture now. When you see people like this guy, Trevor Noah, who I'd never heard of before, actually, but even the one before, is it Jon Stewart you mentioned, and the smugness of them, the smugness of their audiences, and I just think why am I even having to listen to this? Why are you imposing this on me? Because it's it's so distorted.
The kind of imaginary quality of it made me think of the whole concept of Orientalism, Edward Said's Orientalism, and this idea that they're basically othering, to use their own language.
Well, yes, but the thing is, this is the reason
they're creating this weird stereotype that has no basis in reality.
But this was not the case originally. I mean, to say we had a good special relationship was, not hyperbole in the past. We really did. But they're kind of like, there's a totally new kind of attitude and new image of the UK now, which has come. Maybe it's a generational change. Remember, they're all woke and everything. Not unlike the Crown, right? Huge respect usually for the royal family in America. Now they all basically go along with Meghan Markle, or many of them do, right? Enough do. And so now it would be unthinkable, for example, for a member of the royal family to go to New York and get a massive ticker tape reception as the Queen did in the 1950s or 60s, actually going right up to Diana and Charles in the 80s with huge reception. Wouldn't happen now because there's this kind of general hostility to these parts of Britain, these particular aspects of Britain. Huge change in American culture. I mean, I find it so dismaying.
What is that? What's responsible for it?
Well, I think it is.
It's empire, and it's, you know, Britain is seen. You know, there was a wonderful book called Albion Seed, the founding of America, and how whatever part of America you go to, from cuisine to language styles, you can all trace it to different parts of the UK. You know, America very much is Britain's
Do you think
child.
they're sort of trying to palm off their sins?
Well, that's why you have the whole
Britain.
1619 project, right, which has been put forward by the New York Times, and to erase that sort of British connection, the British inheritance. But the broader issue here, I think, for me, is not just
Part
this.
of the exorcism, basically. The exorcism of America is to also purge anything that is British.
The purging will never stop.
Yeah.
So the purging will never stop.
But the broader issue for me here, when you see something which is blatant propaganda, blatant lying, is the undue influence that these comedy shows now have over our young. And this is a sickness that's happening now in this country. You've got the MASH report, which is exactly modelled on this programme we're talking about with that terrible Nish Kumar person. And then you've got the last leg on Channel 4 with this one-legged Australian comedian there doing a very similar thing. And then Russell Howard also has on BBC a similar show. Now, this is what the young people are watching. It's left-leaning Marxist comedians giving their take on world affairs and on the news. And it's being treated uncritically by the audiences who think this is an accurate portrayal of the facts and the reality. And of course, these comedians aren't educated in politics. They've got no idea about these sorts of things. They're just giving their opinion as anybody else has an opinion. And yet it's forming the minds of the youth in Britain and America and in Canada and Australia.
Anyone who wants that needs to tune into Headliners on GB News, because it is actually genuinely the most entertaining pay-per-view show. Let's move on to another topic that I picked out for this week, just because it slipped by the wayside. No one's really been discussing this. Obviously, it's and I'll go into it in a bit more detail, but this issue surrounding euthanasia has obviously been silently happening in the background and has reached a peak. And there have been 2 articles this week, one in Spiked, one by Douglas Murray in The Spectator. And it's horrifying, genuinely horrifying. So in Canada, and I know, Rafe, you're very familiar with Canada and Canadian affairs, they have expanded their euthanasia law to include the mentally ill. And there's a guy here, I've got a quote from him, a guy called Louis Roy from Quebec College of Physicians, who said that euthanasia should be offered to children born with severe disabilities up to the age of 1, which is essentially just advocating for murder, in my opinion, and to elderly people who are tired of living. And there are statistics also from Health Canada of people wanting euthanasia. The reasons they cite are for things like loneliness, or because they believe they'd be a burden to their family and friends. And a psychiatrist as well, saying that one patient told him that he wanted it because he believed no one would ever love him. A veteran suffering from PTSD and a brain injury was outraged when he was offered euthanasia. So these stories go on and on and on. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because I mentioned Douglas's article in The Spectator this week. I had heard nothing about this. And if it wasn't for Douglas's article, I don't think I would have. It's totally horrifying. This Belgian schoolgirl who was on a trip, school trip, when a terror attack happened, all of her schoolmates were killed. She managed to survive. She was only 17. Now some years have passed, not many. She was still very young. She was suffering from PTSD and depression that the Belgian state regarded as being incurable, and so they euthanized her. And the official who oversaw the case, I'll read the quote out, said that it was because she was in such a state of mental suffering that her request was logically accepted. So I wanted to get your view on this, because I know people have talked about things like the slippery slope before, but this is very worrying to me, and I can just so easily envisage the dystopian situation in which this meshes in with all of the other ills in our society at the moment, including things like cancel culture and people's financial hardship and so on, that really we have, on that slippery slope, gone from the bare bones justification for euthanasia to basically euthanizing people because they're sad or lonely or feel that no one will ever love them.
Wait a minute, when you say euthanizing, you have to
remember,
technically they say they want to be. You have to remember that. I mean, it's not like they're being dragged off the street or whatever. That doesn't change anything in my eye. But let's just be clear about that. They didn't just put her down.
No.
Whatever.
But someone does have to.
It's one of those
euthanize
things.
you.
The way it's presented, the argument for euthanasia, the way it's presented, sometimes seems undeniable. You know, in the sense that if people really want to, if they've got terminal illness, all of that, and when you're looking at this, you think, well, yes, I can understand that, but there's just an instinct, the back of one's mind, at least at the back of my mind. I think actually, no, this is the road to hell being paved with good intentions, you know. So on the general issue of euthanasia, no, I think it's also interesting to me, and I know it's widening it a bit. I don't know what you feel, but if you look at because I think this will become a great liberal issue, like abortion. If you look at these sort of issues that are the real, you know, not shibboleths exactly, but the real kind of landmark issues for liberal, where you stand on abortion, where you stand on gay marriage, and also increasingly on euthanasia, what do they all have in common? They sort of have the not continuing of the species in common. I mean, you know, that's what alarms me a little bit. It's like almost that it's anything that's anti-life. This could only happen when a religious structure has entirely gone, I feel.
There's also something slightly eugenicist, I think, about this. The idea that someone living an undesirable existence could logically use that as an argument for the state assisting them in offing themselves.
And when you see the comments of this Canadian medical person, Roy, who's quite high up in all of these things, and the way he's treating and reacts to all of this is in that very clinical, unemotional way, which you do sort of equate with the eugenicist movement, where of course they saw it actually as being a way to relieve suffering, right? Why, if you're a young child, why have your entire life in poverty and suffering when you can just euthanize that 3-year-old and have him avoid decades of life?
There was actually a quote from a eugenicist that was cited in the Spiked article that I mentioned, where this eugenicist was saying that this person would rather chloroform I'm paraphrasing, but would rather basically go into the streets and chloroform the poor and the helpless rather than see them suffer. Which is, it goes back to an attitude that I think we see more broadly in society, which is this sort of really nasty attitude of I'm doing this for your own good. I'm doing this thing that hurts you, but it's for your own good.
To which the riposte is, who made you God, right? And we wouldn't have any Charlie Chaplins in the world, and all these people who came up from squalor and everything else, and it was through the genius and the perseverance of their character that we had some of the greatest minds. And it's through suffering, of course, that we got some of our greatest works of art and music and so forth, you know, are through people who are distressed. Now, in Belgium and Canada, actually, are the two worst culprits here, but in Belgium, I understand, is only about 30 people have had this happen to them. In Canada, it's 3% of deaths. 3% of deaths, which Canada's death rate is 300,000 a year. We're talking 9,000 people have been euthanized in Canada per year. This is an astonishing thing. Now, I've actually struggled for a long time over the issue of euthanasia. It's a very complicated subject, and it's very sensitive, very emotive. And I never really know one way or the other which side I stand on when it comes to incurable degenerative diseases like motor neuron disease. If you've got a functioning brain, but your entire body breaks down on you and you're incapable of moving, and you've got 20 years of a life where you're trapped and unable to do anything, I can fully understand why somebody would want to have their life ending. Now, an able-bodied person has the right and ability to commit suicide. If your body is unable to perform that act, I can certainly see the example in that sort of a case, or if you're in extreme pain with incurable cancer and you're going to be dying in a year, why not shorten that? I can absolutely understand and sympathize with that. But then, of course, we do have the slippery slope issue. Once you've enacted a legislation for something, as we've seen in Canada, phase 1 of the law in Canada was just for those very valid, I think, reasons. But then came in stage 2, and now you have this stage 3 sort of thing where it's depression, and depression is something which is, never permanent. And it's when you're dealing with mental illnesses, if this girl in Belgium had really wanted to kill herself, she would have done it.
It's also
she would have committed suicide. She has the ability to commit suicide. The fact that these people don't commit suicide but choose the option of going for euthanasia, I think speaks volumes.
And also there was another man cited in one of these stories who was impoverished, and he said that he didn't want to die, but he'd rather be dead than homeless, and he thought he was going to become homeless. So you can
And he was euthanized.
And I don't think he was, but he was somebody who said that under this new expansion of the law, he would be euthanized because he doesn't want to become homeless, he'd rather be dead. And as you were saying about that cold clinical attitude, one of the justifications given in one of the official documents was that it would save taxpayer money on healthcare costs. So it's this sort of like callous calculation of, well, maybe however many thousands of Canadian citizens might be euthanized through this program, but also on the other hand, it means that we don't have to pay for their healthcare or for their therapy or anything like this. And so like this veteran who's obviously fought for his country, and now they're suggesting to him that maybe he might like to kill himself because he's got PTSD rather than actually.
Can you imagine it? Can you imagine going to see your doctor and he says, "Well, mate, maybe you want to have euthanasia," and that's never even in your radar before that point.
I think
shocking.
I would agree. I have that same feeling about people who've got shocking kind of quality of life, no quality of life. Absolutely. But I think that ultimately the best guide here, like I applied it during the pandemic, for example, is to look at the people who are really supporting it. And then that should make your mind up for you in a way. Even if you sort of feel, yes, I can see the point of that, but I'm a bit on the fence. If you look at the people, it's like the people who the most rigid when it comes to mask wearing, for example. I know a lot about, I can tell what they're like. And it's the same with euthanasia. What kind of person would devote themselves to getting euthanasia on the statute book? That's how I look at it. What's your motive?
I'd be very interested to know what our viewers think, if you wanted to comment below, because I think probably there's a wider variety of opinion on this issue than on most.
I remember with my father, people always say, if I had that, I want, put a pillow over my head, I wouldn't want to live in it. Life becomes very sweet, however ill. But
there's another aspect of this too, which I forgot to mention, which is of course assisted suicide rather than euthanasia. So, rather than the big problem is giving doctors the power of life and death over an individual. Whereas, of course, we do know, of a loving spouse who may want to help their partner go through if their partner's life is complete agony and pain every day and there's no value to it. You can look to see who's supporting these things, but for these certain cases, I sort of think, what would I do in that position if I was in pain every single day and I could conceivably live for another 20 years, where every day was abject agony? How would I want to end my days?
Well, though you see, yes, but it's an odd way that the law brings about certain kinds of behaviour. If you were that person's partner and you helped them, there would be consequences for you.
That's what I mean.
So therefore, you could say, well, in that case, it's utterly fail-safe in an odd way. It's when somehow or other someone can go along, some little old lady who's been pressurized, the family, you know what families can be like, oh, come on, you're obviously losing your mind, and all the rest of it. And she goes along and says, I think exactly. I want to.
That's why it's very complicated. But I think assisted suicide, I'd be happier with that sort of thing being legalised rather than euthanasia.
Yes.
I think ultimately as well that you were talking about this sort of drive within our society. It's a kind of death instinct. And I think that actually all of this is another sign that we've basically lost the structure of society that would give those people hope and reason to live and to pull them out of that atomized existence that is making them feel lonely. But anyway, we're going to have to end on that note. So I think we could probably talk about this issue for a lot longer. I'd love to know what you think. So please do comment below. Let us know what you think on this topic, on any of the topics that we've discussed today.
Been getting some very good comments lately, actually, haven't we, on the show? Yeah.
Yes, so please continue the discussion in the comment section. Thank you, Peter.
Do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.
Thank you, Ray. Like, subscribe, comment below. We'll see you next time on Newspeak.
Yeah. Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.